And now we have Sarah. Sarah, welcome to the conference, and thank you for joining us. Let me get back up to Sarah's bio. Her bio is actually in the chat section of this conference. So if you'd like to look up the information about Sarah, but she's with Amnesty International. And also she's a very world-renowned author and published a number of books. So Sarah, we're not going to take up your time. Thank you for being here, and please go ahead and share with our audience.
Hi, thank you. Just checking, is the microphone working?
Yes, you're coming through loud and clear. We can't see you, but you're coming through loud and clear.
Yeah, I have the video off because the environment that we're in. So I'm in my bedroom and I didn't feel it was.
That's no problem. We're glad to have you.
Background. But thank you very much. And I appreciate the invitation to speak. I was asked to speak today about the human rights situation related to the coronavirus pandemic that we're experiencing right now, as it impacts the continent. So I just prepared some remarks in relation to that, and then look forward to questions and conversation. So the situation definitely varies by country, but the majority of African countries struggle with understaffed and underfunded healthcare systems as a result of decades of neglect by African governments, which is from a multitude of reasons. There's a discussion of corruption earlier, which definitely has also often played a role, but just a shifting of priorities in regards to how funds had been spent, and then just a lack of appropriate development goals within that sector as well. One statistic is noted that countries in sub-Saharan Africa have 0.2 physicians for every 1,000 people, while OECD countries average 2.9 doctors for every 1,000 people. So you can see where we're at a deficit on the continent as a starting point. One thing that the continent does have is a lot of institutional knowledge related to pandemics and virulent diseases due to Ebola and some measles outbreaks and things like that has been leveraged very effectively. But that institutional knowledge can't fill the gap when there's just not enough beds for patients as well. And one study showed that there's 5 hospital beds for every 1 million people in Africa, while the US averages 5,000 beds per million. So you can see the starting point from which things are moving forward when a pandemic strikes on the continent. But these figures also don't take into account the overcrowded conditions in prisons, as well as settlement camps that are hosting Africa's displaced population. According to the UNHCR, Africa had 24,213,204 displaced persons in the last year. You understand what I'm saying? That was the most recent count. That isn't meaning 24 million people were displaced just in the last year alone. These individuals living in these settlement camps and refugee camps have minimal access to healthcare and are dependent on assistance from governments. And so one thing that also has been an issue is that a lot of these camps, these settlement camps, the people housed there are not allowed to gain citizenship in the country in which they're housed. They're not allowed formal employment, and they're really not allowed to leave the camps. So social distancing and exploring other options to try to increase their safety from the virus is just really not even an option. Basic human rights have been further at risk with the COVID-19 crisis. The ability of security forces to protect and maintain the rule of law in a manner that adheres to international and regional standards is doubtful, as accountability and civilian oversight has been diminished. Police and military have been videotaped beating individuals for violating shelter-in-place restrictions. There's lots of images that have come out from Kenya and South Africa that I'm aware of, but I'm sure that those are by far from isolated incidences. They also face increased risk of exposure to COVID-19 due to I'm repeating myself. Additionally, we've noted indefinite states of emergency that reduce government accountability. There have been enhanced restrictions placed on freedom of expression and access to information. There's one case in Zimbabwe that I have been involved with in my work that exemplifies the government exploitation of COVID-19 restrictions to harass and restrict government opposition figures and human rights defenders. So on May 13, 3 opposition activists, one a member of parliament, were arrested at a police roadblock in Harare for leading an anti-government protest about the authorities' response to the COVID-19 pandemic and widespread hunger issues that Zimbabwe is experiencing. Following their arrest at the roadblock, they were taken to Harare Central Police Station, where they were asked to get into another vehicle under the pretext that they were being taken to Warren Park Police Station. However, they never made it there. They were forcibly disappeared. 2 days later, they were found over 50 miles from Harare, and the activists reported that they had been tortured and sexually assaulted. They were taken for treatment in the hospital, but there has been no investigation initiated into their disappearance and their credible allegations of torture. However, on May 26th, the police charged the activists with gathering with intent to promote public violence and breach of peace. And that's in relation to the protest related to the COVID-19 restrictions and hunger. So they used a pretext of COVID-19 related issues as a way to suppress opposition voices. The authorities charged the women and deployed prison guards and police to their hospital, forcing them to wear prison clothing, even though they had been granted bail under those charges. The authorities called their abduction fake, and they were subsequently rearrested last week on charges of falsifying the report of their abduction, and they were denied bail this Monday. And they were remanded to prison until June 26, where they face up to 20 years in prison and fines for the charges of falsifying their abduction report. So it also exemplifies the issues because now these women who are opposition figures are put into a prison overcrowding situation where it increases their danger in terms of the virus. So it's another way that the government is able to utilize what's happening as a way to suppress voices. Amnesty's also noted a lot of freedom of the press issues. Governments have used the pretext of the pandemic to further restrict press freedoms. The weapons of repression against individual journalists, as well as news organizations, have been greatly strengthened in many countries, including deterrent prison sentences being enacted. So it's up to 6 months in South Africa, 5 years in Botswana, up to 20 years in Zimbabwe, as examples. Sorry, I just saw a message popping up from the Zoom, so I wanted to check it. In Egypt, the Supreme Council for Media Regulation asked that ordinary citizens report on the publication of fake news about the pandemic. The implementation of these emergency laws often show a broad acceptance of the idea of fake news, which is not a phrase that is new from 2016, but is definitely a phrase that has proliferated a lot since 2016. And there's no need to state why. We are all aware well of who trumpets against fake news on a regular basis. The implementation of these emergency they are also used to deter criticism and muzzle opposition. Some examples of countries that have used the COVID-19 crisis to restrict media freedoms is Namibia. They've used the opportunity to restrict attendance at press conferences. So rather than just allowing for social distancing, they have restricted attendance. Egypt, Botswana, and Somalia, only government statements on the subject may be published. In Swaziland, using printed and electronic media to obtain information about COVID-19 is banned without prior permission of the health ministry. In Liberia, the justice authorities have threatened to close down or seize any news organization that publishes what they consider to be false information. And in Ethiopia, the definition of misinformation is so broad that it gives the authorities the discretionary power to declare any piece of information as fake. So what work has been being done on the continent? So in addition to what I mentioned before, where countries that have experienced Ebola, measles, and other pandemics have been able to leverage that institutional knowledge, Ghana, South Africa, Nigeria, Guinea, Kenya, and Senegal have also pioneered solutions. These include interactive public transport, contact tracing mobile applications, dynamic data analytics systems, rapid diagnostic testing kits, mobile testing booths, and low-cost critical care beds. So what is needed to move forward with trying to assist the continent to suppress the pandemic, as well as prepare for other incidences that could arise in the future? One suggestion is to strengthen and rebuild their healthcare systems instituted through a Marshall Plan level funding, to provide debt relief and access to IMF financial tools, to provide emergency food and resources, and to urge governments to protect human rights and civic space. So those were the remarks that I had. So I will yield back my time and wait for questions.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah, for being with us. First question would be, what do you see as far as governments across the African continent continuing to suppress or remove the rights of citizens or even use media to share information about the COVID-19, but really anything else that it seems to feel is sensitive as far as its public is concerned and the institutions within these various countries?
So, yeah, as I had noted, we've definitely seen an impact on suppression of the press, as well as opposition figures and voices that are critical of the response. This is definitely not unique to the continent by any stretch. President Trump defends his actions, his government actions, and his responses all the time. Other countries have also defended steps that they've taken. So it's not unique for a government to flail around and defend its behavior. But we have noticed that, because this is geared towards the continent, that there has been a definite increase in trying to leverage what is happening as a way to consolidate power, silence voices, and it's unlikely that a lot of these restrictions will then be dialed back. So, some of them in relation to, the proliferation of quote unquote fake news don't necessarily call out COVID-19. They just say that, anything that is fake news is punishable. And so there's no reason then for a government to dial that back. It can continue going forward. So we need to keep an eye on those sorts of things and work to make sure that those are not enforced going forward, in addition to working to try to dial back what's happening right now.
So, Sarah, what you're saying is COVID-19 is just a cover and excuse to suppress other information and other sharing and activities by the publics in these different countries that the governments wanted to do anyway.
Yeah, so some of the regulations specifically relate to the pandemic. And so unless they are not modified, and or their judiciary does not expand their application, those laws and regulations will expire when the pandemic expires. So while they're concerning and worrisome, they're not as a critical nature as the ones such as Egypt enacted and Ethiopia enacted, where it just relates to fake news broadly. So, whether it's an opportunistic grabbing of a situation to create further suppression, or it's just, a not well thought out, but a considered happy circumstance by a government that they can continue to utilize. I'm not in a position to impose, that concept on, how a government is operated, but it has led to these situations that we need to be mindful of and observing.
Okay.